Well, I do, but I don't.
All right, everyone, good morning. You've all probably find yourself in the Gospel of John class. My name is Jay Pennell. A lot of you all know me from other classes, or many of you actually had the chance to watch me grow up. I've been in a small group, or I've taught and done a lot of different things. This right here is my family. My oldest is right here. His name is Ezra. Middle, Abigail. Youngest, Levi. And my much prettier and better half, Lindsay, is right there. Since we're running a little bit late due to service running over a smidge, I'm going to get going and we're going to try and get through as much as we can today. The description for this class, for those of you who didn't get a chance to read it, goes something like this. When the world seems too short on patience and too absolute in its ideals, I go to the margins. I like to go to those who get left out, neglected, and misunderstood. In many ways, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the in crowd. They even get a group name, the Synoptics. That is why the Gospel of John continually fascinates me. It isn't a gospel for the Jewish or Roman insiders, nor is it a gospel for the faithful like Mark. It is the good news for everyone else, the outcast, the dissenter, the people we have to keep around but wish they would go away on their own. I often find a home among these people because I get to be myself. Freddie Mercury of Queen connects well with this idea when he notes their band's brand. Now, we're four misfits who don't belong together. We're playing for other misfits. They're the outcasts, right at the back of the room. We're pretty sure they don't belong. We belong to them. The Gospel of John belongs to those who misfit the other Gospels. In this class, we're going to re-examine the Gospel according to John, not through the typical Jewish or Roman lens afforded to us through the other Gospels, but through the lens of Greek philosophy. Not that the lens of Jewish or Roman history or way of thinking is wrong, but we're going to do something a little bit different. When we understand the story of Jesus in this unique light, we will be challenged to engage the gospel in its original audience's terms. Then we can attempt to draw profound parallels between our daily internal and societal lives. The format of this class will be lecture-based, but I hope you bring questions and interrupt me with them. For those of you who have heard me teach before, I tend to do quite a bit better when I get asked questions. There's no prior knowledge necessary. I'm going to try and start from as basic a level as I can. To give you a little bit about how I'm approaching this class personally, I'm going to pull a quote from Confucius, actually. He says, "I am a transmitter rather than an original thinker. I trust and enjoy the teachings of the ancients." And I trust and enjoy the teachings of the ancients as well. Here's kind of a theme quote as we go along, something maybe to keep in the back of your head as we get really nerdy occasionally in this class. It's from Jim Harrison and his work, Old, Faithful, and Mysterious. He says, "The wilderness is mainly the wilderness because it's hard to get to and rough to travel through, and the particularities of nature have to be known to enjoy it in any viable way." So, as we get really nerdy and really dense, I'm trying to give you guys some particularities to help you enjoy this gospel a little bit differently, a little bit more nuanced, and a little bit, hopefully, stronger, faith-building for you. Now, the Gospel of John. This is a definition of the Gospel of John from Harvard Divinity School. 3 of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament are known as the Synoptic Gospels because they recount similar stories about Jesus in a similar sequence. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The Gospel of John is unique in both voice and focus. So what is it about John that makes him unique in both voice and focus? Well, if you look at history and you think about how the Gospels were written, when they were composed, and the major events surrounding the writers' lives, you can kind of see a breakdown in what's going on. Most people date Mark to somewhere around 60 CE. Matthew, somewhere between 50 and 80 CE. Luke, a little bit later, sometime around 70 to about 100. But John, usually the earliest dating starts in 90. Some people have it go as late as 120. So it's the latest or the last gospel. So in many ways, John actually has the other gospel writers available to him as he's writing his gospel. So he has seen or has noticed their words and how they're doing it. And so he's coming at it from a little bit of a different perspective. But not only does he have the previous gospels, there are two major events that are going to radically shape how he has to communicate the good news of Jesus. The first of those is the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, the destruction of the Second Temple was a terrible and horrible event in history, particularly for the Jews. But most historians will agree that while it was terrible for the Jews, it was probably the catalyst to grow Christianity. You can see here at the Arch of Titus a depiction of the menorah being carried away to Rome. But what they did is they moved from this small circle down here in Judea in a one centralized location and spread across the entirety of the Roman Empire. And not just over a few decades, but rapidly. They moved quickly. And when you have all these Christians move all over the place, what becomes the standard? What are they going to look to? How are they going to describe themselves? How are they going to follow Jesus? And the first Gospels end up becoming really important in that. But before they were even written, there was another guy who wrote a lot to help guide Christians, and his works were widely circulated everywhere. And those were the works of Paul. So in the background of John, you have a variety of cultural groups now spread across the entirety of the Roman Empire. And then you have Paul. And Paul radically changes the theology of the early Christians from being very Jewish-centric to being very inclusive of everyone. And he does this specifically through his theology of the resurrection. When we think of Paul and we think of Jesus, and one of their primary questions that they're working through in their lives, they have to answer this question. And this is a very Jewish question. They are trying to answer the question, where is God? Or who is God with? Now, this question is actually a subset of a question that is very common to everyone throughout history and throughout time. It's actually a subset of the question of how do you live the good life? Or even what is the good life? Is it worth living? How do you do that? For the Jews, the way they answer that question is by figuring out where is God or who is God with. If you think about the Jewish story in the Old Testament, when God is with the Jews, life is good. Even if things seem bad, like Babylonian captivity, when God is with people like Daniel or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, then life is okay, or life is good. And so Jesus and Paul must answer this question. Now, if we think about the typical politics of their days, where you have the left, right, and center, we come up with a few different people groups. We have the Sadducees, imagine that they're over here on the right. We have the Zealots, or the Sicarii, over on the left. And then we have the Essenes, who would probably be angry that they're even on this map at all. But that leaves the middle wide open. And that's where the Pharisees are going to occupy. Then we have John the Baptist, who is like Pharisee adjacent, but kind of likes to be with the Essenes because he's out in the wilderness all the time. But he kind of agrees with a lot of the things the Pharisees are saying. And then you have Jesus over here and Saul over here. And you could probably flip-flop Jesus and Saul depending upon the issue. The important point for today is that Saul tends to be a counter or a foil for Jesus. Now, they're all going to answer this question, where is God or who is God with, differently based on where you sit. So the Sadducees are going to say God is with us. And they're going to quote something like Deuteronomy 28. Verses 10 through 11. Then all the peoples on earth will see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they will fear you. The Lord will grant you abundant prosperity in the fruit of your womb, the young of your livestock, and the crops of your ground, in the land he swore to your ancestors to give you. So the Sadducees are living well, and life is going really well for them. And so they're going to answer this question that God is with us because we're doing well. is kind of their logic. It's the way they're going to go. Now, the other groups are going to say God is not with us. For the Zealots or the Sicarii, they're going to quote something like Deuteronomy 7. Here it is in verse 1. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations. So their thought process is God is not with us because life isn't going well. And the reason it's not going well is we need to drive out the nations before us. So they're going to quite literally kill people in order to drive out the nations, and then God will be with them. In the middle, you have the Pharisees, who are going to use something like Deuteronomy 11:22. If you carefully observe all these commands I am giving you to follow, then to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience with him, and to hold fast to him, then the Lord will drive out all these nations before you, and you will dispossess nations larger and stronger than you. So why aren't they dispossessing nations that are larger and stronger than them, like Rome? Well, it's sin. They're not following the commands. They're not walking in obedience. And so for the Pharisees and the Zealots, life isn't going as well. And so why is God not with us? Well, for the Pharisees, it's sin. For the Zealots, they're not driving people out. For the Sadducees, on the other hand, life is great. They have wealth, they have land, they have privilege, so God must be with them. Now, if you'll notice, I picked verses here all in Deuteronomy. So there's an inherent tension in the understanding of the texts that are built into this question. So it's not just cut and dry like we might wish it to be. And so when Paul and Jesus enter into this scene, they're going to have to navigate this tension. You might be able to say that one is wrong versus one is the other, but these people are using their life experience to justify one thing or the other. And it's very difficult to overcome someone's life experience to convince them of something else. So let's dive into Jesus and Saul. So remember, they're both Pharisees, so God is not with us. And the reason, again, is sin. Now, sin can be broken down roughly, and there's a lot of slosh in between this, so it's not a perfect breakdown, into kind of two categories: righteousness and purity. So purity, you can think about dietary laws, Sabbath keeping, intermarriage. These become some of the big purity questions for the Jews of the day. And then there's righteousness, how you treat someone, how you interact with people. Do you treat them well? Are you fair? Do you use fair weights and measures? These are all kind of things of righteousness. Now, again, it's not perfect. There's some slosh in between. And for many Jews, they would say, if you're not pure, you can't be righteous. And in particular, we're going to see that while Saul and Jesus both agree that sin is the problem, we're going to see Saul lean towards purity. Now, as Saul leans towards purity, he's going to think about a character who last had God with him. For him, that might be someone like Nehemiah. Now, if you think about Nehemiah's story, if you go back and you think about what he did and how God was with him, you think about his prayers and you think about what he was going for and how he accomplished it. And one of the key texts and reasons that Nehemiah is so successful, or at least in Nehemiah's mind, is he drives out the people from doing trade during the Sabbath, and he ends a lot of intermarriage. If you read through the book of Ezra, you see the people come through and they really focus on this idea of purity. And so for Paul, it makes perfect sense, or for Saul, it makes perfect sense when you read something like Nehemiah that purity must be the problem, particularly because that's what you can see. You can order the world around purity. It becomes very black and white. One of the laws in Leviticus regards shrimp. Did you eat shrimp today or not? It's very black and white. Are you pure or are you not? Jesus, however, is going to shift towards righteousness. And most interestingly, he's going to use something like the Good Samaritan. Now, a Samaritan, according to Jewish law, was incapable of being pure. There was nothing they could do to be pure. But when he gives us the greatest commandment, and his follow-up explanation to the person who follows the greatest commandment is a Samaritan, we can see Jesus shifting away from the kind of purity towards a righteousness, a man who treated another person well regardless of their standing. And when we live righteously for Jesus, he's going to say something like, God is among us. In Luke 17:21, starting in verse 20. Once on being asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, Jesus replied, the coming of the kingdom of God is not something that can be observed, nor will people say, here it is, or there it is, because the kingdom of God is in your midst. So for Jesus, this righteousness is something that's being pushed among the people, and it's not going to be very black or white. It's not going to be easy to point out to say, oh, you are and you aren't. And this is going to shape eventually Paul's understanding of the resurrection. Now, the result of this is going to be something that we could describe as God's justice. Now, when I taught this little bit last 2 quarters ago now, Mark Brosey aptly asked a question. He said, what do I mean by God's justice? That was a great question. And it's one that hopefully we'll be able to get to as we get through this class, or you'll uncover as we get through this class. But there's one more thing that Jesus is going to be doing as he goes through this idea of purity. So purity in the Bible. In the Bible, we start kind of with this story of Abraham. And if we remember Abraham's faith, it's not credited to him as purity, it's credited to him as righteousness. So we have this kind of pre-Torah person whose faith works through righteousness or right acting towards other people. Then we have Torah. And when we have Torah, only impurity is passable. And that anything associated with death is impure. So if you touch something that is associated with death, you become unclean. If you become unclean, then you can pass that uncleanliness to another person, and so on and so on. So the only uncleanliness is something that can be passed, and this is Torah law. Then we have something like Isaiah 6 happens. Isaiah 6 is that famous passage where Isaiah shows up in God's throne room. When he shows up in God's throne room, a seraphim comes and touches his lips with a coal. And for the first time since Abraham, someone has become clean by touching something else. So cleanliness has been passed. When we get to Jesus, purity can be passed. He's letting unclean women touch him. He's going to the sick. He's going to the sinners, and he's passing out purity over and over and over again. And that's what ultimately frustrates the Pharisees so much, is he's passing out this purity when that is their rule and their order and their way of thinking about why God is not with them. Jesus is just passing it out freely to all these people, to these children, to these women, to these sick people, to the lame, to the sinners, the tax collectors, and he's just passing it out. And I can imagine how frustrating that would be to a Pharisee when the way you think about and the way you interpret and the way you understand the world is through these black and white purity laws. And here Jesus is just passing out purity. Here you go, here you go, here you go. This will continue in the book of Acts when the Gentiles, which I don't have on here, darn, when the Gentiles start getting the Spirit poured out on them randomly, or seemingly randomly, by design, without having to convert to Judaism first. The Spirit ends up getting poured out on these Gentiles without having to convert through Judaism. In Paul's day, that was primarily through the idea of circumcision. And so this act of purity being passed out in Jesus is something that will continue on. So how does Paul deal with this? This is all of Paul's letters in like 5 minutes, so broad brushstrokes here. But Paul isn't going to abandon his purity kind of ideas necessarily. He's actually going to work through them. In Romans, he's going to call the law death, or he's going to allude to that the law is death. And this is actually more so the idea that purity comes through touching things that are dead, and that death is is connected to the idea of purity. And so sin, therefore, is death for Paul. So he's not going to disagree with that approach. But what he is going to take the next step as saying is that we are resurrected people. When we participate in the resurrection of Jesus, we go through this death And so we no longer need necessarily to keep these purity laws. Now, does he think they're a good idea? Paul is a Jew of Jews. He probably followed the purity laws his whole life. But they aren't necessarily necessary. That's his argument. That's his argument in Romans and Ephesians. This is why Peter and Paul end up fighting so much later in Acts. And it's partially has to do with what God's revelation to Peter is in Acts 10, when you think about how he shows them the unclean food, and now he's supposed to be eating. So it is through this resurrection for Paul that he's again answering this question of where is God, or who is God with. And through the resurrection, God is among us. We can participate in God. Through the resurrection, we become righteous. Think about righteousness as right acting. When I taught this last time, class went way over. And I had a daughter that I needed to pick up. I was probably acting rightly to my class by continuing the discussion. But I was not acting rightly towards my daughter, nor to Miss Jessica, who sits over there, who was watching and taking care of my daughter. So you can see how difficult something like righteousness becomes very quickly in a silly kind of simple example. And so for Paul, who can be righteous? No one. No one can act rightly towards everyone all the time. And so we need the resurrection and the redemption of Jesus to act righteously, which will lead to the fruit of God's justice. Again, something that we'll hopefully talk about. So Chad Crawford actually came up with this a couple weeks ago, and he said it, so you give him all the credit, and if I don't do it justice, it's my fault. What Paul has done here is he's created a well for people of all different types, creeds, races, ways of thinking to come and drink the water of life. And he's torn down the fences and the barriers that we often erect around what it means to be Christian. Again, if I butchered that, that's my fault, not Chad's. So John has this destruction of the fences, and he has two options here. He can recreate the fences in his gospel. That's a totally viable option. Or he can embrace Paul. A tough option as well, considering how complicated Paul's theology is, despite me putting it on like 2 slides right there. So what is he going to do? How is he going to do this? He has these Christians who are spread all throughout the Roman Empire. And they're reading Paul, because Paul's the most prolific writer at the point of the destruction of the Second Temple. They have copies of him in Ephesus, in Antioch, in Corinth, in Alexandria, in Rome. They have copies of what Paul's written all over the place, and they're all reading Paul as kind of a standard. So for John to go against Paul, he's really going to have to bring the hammer. He could nuance Paul a little bit, or he could embrace him. I think what John does is embrace him. And the way he's going to do that is communicate across the Roman Empire. So how do you communicate the good news in an understandable format across this entire empire? Well, you might think the obvious answer is Latin. Arthur Herman notes in his book, The Cave and the Light, which you guys will get to hear a lot about, notes the Romans weren't really philosophers as much as practical thinkers. The greatest truly Roman philosopher, Cicero, failed to truly appreciate a lot of the Greek philosophy out beyond its immediate usefulness. When you think of the great Roman philosophers, they actually come from Greek schools. They're either Platonist, Aristotelian, Epicurean, Stoic. Seneca might be one of the most famous Roman philosophers, and he's most notably a Stoic, which is Greek philosophy. Why not Hebrew? Well, I think Paul actually tried this on the Areopagus. I think Paul actually tried to kind of communicate to the Athenians this question of who is God, or where is God, or who is God with, to the Athenians. And he kind of fell flat. He got some people, but for the most part, he fell flat. Also, Hebrew wasn't widely understood across the Roman Empire. The next question, why not something Eastern? I began this class with a quote from Confucius. So why not something like Buddhism or something like that? Celsus, an early writer, not to be confused with Celsius, the guy who gets the temperature named after him, actually complained about John and Paul for that exact reason, that it was too Eastern. And by Eastern, he means Iranian or Indian. That's Confucius and Buddhism or Hinduism. We don't have his works, or maybe I would teach the class that way. So then we come up with why Greek. Well, I think the answer is a little bit simpler than we end up making it. This is a map of Alexander the Great's empire. You can see where he conquers all the way from Greece to India. It's actually a larger empire than the Romans hold at the time. And if the Romans weren't necessarily thinkers, who were the thinkers that set up the Romans? Well, that was the Greeks. Now, Alexander conquers this in around 300 BC. So it's had 300 years of conquering. For those of you who don't know, Alexander's tutor was Aristotle. Aristotle's teacher, Plato. Plato's teacher, Socrates. So when Alexander the Great is conquering all these lands and he's beating up on these people, and they look at him and they go, how are you so successful? When they ask his commanders, how are they so successful? What's going on? What's different about you guys? And when he's able to answer with Greek philosophy, that's going to infuse Greek philosophy across the known world. Now, those people don't always agree with Greek philosophy. I'm not saying that they could, should, or do. But the fact is that it was present. And because it was present, that gave people time to translate it into their own ways of thinking, their own methods of thinking, how they answer their own questions in their own ways. So we have this explosion of Greek philosophy across the known world, and it's being carried by the conqueror, Alexander the Great. And so Greek questions like what is real, or what is the good life, or what is reason, are something that is carried and then translated in the variety of cultures. So when John has to write something across an empire, he's going to pick something that's already been translated. And it's had 500 years to be translated by the time John is writing this. So it's not like he's just expecting it, oh, well, I'll write in Greek because you could at least have some sort of reference. It's had 500 years to kind of seep into the soil and to grow out of it. If I were writing the gospel today, I would write it in American English because our media is everywhere. Our ideas, our way of thinking is everywhere. Xi Jinping of China was recently quoted as reading the founding fathers. Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, both of the Roosevelts, because he was curious how they were able to create an idea of Pax Americana or manifest destiny. He wants to do the same thing in China, not necessarily with the same methods. He wants to take them and translate them into something that will work for the Chinese. In the same way, the Greek philosophers were carried by Alexander the Great to all of these places, and then they were translated into those times and cultures. So when John uses Greek philosophy to communicate the good news of Jesus Christ, he's using the most common language that exists to him in that day. And so Greek philosophy and understanding the world in Greek philosophy becomes really important. It's the way that we create that well, because it opens up a way of understanding the good news to the most people that he can possibly reach. And he's going to do that starting in chapter 1, verse 1, with the Logos. And so next week, we are going to go in deep into the Logos. And we're actually going to follow John's structure. So if it ever gets confusing to you or you go, why are we doing this when? I'm actually just going to follow through John's chapters. And I'm going to structure the class the way John did. And trust that he had a good reason for the way he did it, and we'll uncover that as we go along. But it all starts with this idea of the logos and what that means in Greek philosophical terms. So next week, if you want to do some pre-reading, you can read Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, the Stoics, or you can just read John 1:1 and contemplate what that means in your life. So we actually ended early, which is fabulous. So any questions for me so far? I know that was like drinking from a fire hose, and I actually like cut stuff off. Go ahead.
I guess my question is, how did an uneducated fisherman know all this Greek philosophy?
So that's a great question. I think when he was exiled to the island, he actually ended up in Ephesus after his attempt of boiling alive. There's some interesting historical evidence. Ephesus is one of the world's oldest libraries. The other big library would have been in Alexandria or Athens. Those would have been kind of the three big places that he could have ended up. And it's most likely that scholars, through a lot of historical evidence and stuff like that, think he ended up in prison in Ephesus for the rest of his life, basically, which means he would have more or less had access to the older Greek thinkers of Plato and Aristotle in Ephesus, and the biggest Greek philosopher of Heraclitus, who we'll talk a little bit about next week. But good question. Anyone else?
He was also guided by the Spirit.
Yes.
That's the easy answer.
Yes, but that's a little bit of a cop-out answer. I will.
So timeline-wise, was he before Plato, Aristotle, and then after?
So Plato and Aristotle were about, so Aristotle was Alexander's tutor. So if we saw Alexander doing his conquest in the early 300s BC, that's about 400 years before John. Socrates was in the 400s range. We're not quite 100% sure. And Plato was his student, and Aristotle, Plato's student. So you can kind of fill in the age gaps going back from Alexander's conquest that they had roughly, if you put them all around 400 BCE, then that's about when most of the Greek thinkers were active that we'll be talking about.
So the Romans being more pragmatic, did they still have a significant level of appreciation for Greek philosophy? I mean, I guess so, otherwise it probably wouldn't have landed as well as it did.
So they were taught it, but it was always kind of in their practical terms. And as the empire, as it shifted from more republic to empire, there started to pop up more Greek schools so that they could appreciate it, so that they did have a philosophical foundation. Marcus Aurelius is one of the most famous emperors and philosophers of Rome, and he grew up in, I believe, Macedon. So that's all Greek philosophy right there. And so in many ways they were shaped by it, especially once the empire began. And we'll look in a couple of weeks how they interacted when we look at Caesar Augustus and Octavian, and they're the same person. You'll see a little bit of how the Roman Greeks interacted in that. Good question. Other questions? All right, well, thank you very much for coming today.